Okay, 2 points to that, if I could.
Please.
Just your initial remarks seem to fly in the face of what Tip O'Neill was noted for saying 30 years ago.
No, absolutely
all
not.
politics are local.
No.
That's a jest. But what about the timing? You know, the first 7 you missed, and the 8th one you showed up just after
sure.
you
No,
announced.
hey, look, that's, I mean, I'd be disingenuous if I were to say that I decided to run for state representative and a town meeting came around and I went to that town meeting. Absolutely. Sit there and listen to what's going on. Hear the people talk about the important issues. That, you know, sure, of course, that timing's not a coincidence. I now have a young daughter who will, like I was, be a product of the Holliston Public Schools, and it makes perfect sense for me to become more engaged locally. I'm working very hard to represent the interests of our town at the State House. That will represent a very significant contribution, and I hope to have the opportunity to do that. I've already done some things that make a real difference in this state, and I want to take that experience and my deep roots and knowledge of our district and apply that.
Okay, that makes it clear to me, and I believe our viewers as well. Carolyn, did you want to add to that?
Just one quick thing. You know, Dan has certainly got strong family ties to the community as well as experience. The reason that I came to this position that I'm running for this office is because I believe that there's nothing more important in being a state representative than being tuned in to the issues of our district, having wrestled with these local issues, seeing firsthand, as I have, dealing with local budgets, trying to get local legislation passed, in bringing that voice to the State House. And frankly, that's what I'm hearing from our local officials. We want to have our voice and our needs represented directly at the State House. That's why I want to bring back office hours to the district. I think it's so important to maintain that communication. And I think it's just a different perspective that I will bring to the State House that's a very important perspective. And it speaks to this frustration issue, which Dan has mentioned a number of times. I think people want to feel more connected to their state government. And I think that's why my local experience is so important.
Okay.
David, I still haven't had a chance to address the 2.5 override issue that I was slugged with a few minutes ago.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Rewinding just a couple minutes.
Yeah, right, because
Sure.
I got that confused with this.
Yeah, no problem. As I started to say, I was glad that Carolyn brought that up because she continues to misunderstand what it was I was saying that night. I was not saying send a message to the State House and they will come solve our fiscal problems. To the contrary, I was saying, and did say quite clearly, I thought what we need to do is quit sending the message to the State House that they can neglect local aid, that they can neglect education funding, and we will simply turn back to our pockets time and time and time again. I've been there. I know they track Prop 2.5 overrides very closely. They watch how many towns are passing them and how often they're failing, and if towns are continually going, people say time after time, the very first question we were ever asked in a debate in this very room was, what's the most important issue? And Carolyn started by saying property taxes. People say property taxes are the most important thing for them out there, and it ties into all sorts of things, but Proposition 2.5 overrides ask people to vote to raise their own property taxes. We need to stop moving in that direction. And so what I was saying, what I said, and this is very consistent with what I've said every single time I've had a chance to in this race, last year we had $1 billion surplus, $1 billion surplus. And yet, not enough local aid came back to our town, to Holliston, our town, or to Hopkinton, or to any of the other towns in our district, to fund so basic a service as school buses for our kids. That's unacceptable. And rather than continue to say, we will allow you, legislature, to continue to get away with this, to continue with paying lip service to the notion that public education is a priority, while you continue to underfund it, we need to draw a line and say, no more. And my opponent's reaction to that in the Metro West Daily News was to say she'd like to look at the law currently requires, state law currently requires free school busing for anyone who lives more than 2 miles from a school. And that's why a fee was imposed on a certain subset of parents whose kids who live within 2 miles.
Just like my house was.
She said she wanted to look at changing that law so that everyone would have to pay a smaller amount. That's a new tax. I want to look at changing that law to require that school busing be provided for everybody. But that's a tax, and her immediate reaction is to turn and say, we all ought to go deeper into our pockets to solve this problem, rather than to turn and say, why is it that the legislature voted along party lines against a bill that would have sent $1 billion surplus back to cities and towns, which would have been somewhere near $1 million for every town in our district?
But didn't that $1 billion turn into a life sciences grant by Governor Patrick?
Well, money is not, it's not, it's not that cause and effect. That $1 billion is over a number of years. But to your point, that $1 billion turned into something other than local aid to fund education. That $1 billion, part of it went to $220 million in earmarked spending that the legislature tacked onto the budget behind closed doors with no accountability and no way for the public to tell who put what in and why. That $1 billion didn't come back here. And they spent that $1 billion plus another $1 billion putting us directly, the math works here. We're $1 billion plus in a hole now. They dug it, and my opponent is constantly saying we ought not to look at blame. We ought to look at blame. And it's not hard to find where the blame lies. It lies with our elected officials who made those decisions. And sooner or later, the voters are going to hold them accountable. I hope they start now.
Okay. So, fair being fair, it's time for Dan to ask his question of you. And that is, Carolyn, you've occasionally agreed with me about the need to control spending. To control spending and enact reforms before our legislature comes again to the taxpayers' wallets. But you've also made frequent mention of what you see as a need for new revenues. Will you be willing to join me in promising tonight that you will vote against any and all tax increases, at least until our budget is balanced?
Well, I will again agree with Dan that we need to enact reforms and, carefully manage our spending before we even consider any kind of revenue increases. I think clearly in this current economic situation, any kind of tax increase should absolutely be a last resort. People are having a tough time enough as it is. But, and I will make a pledge here now to the public that I will certainly act in the public's best interest. I will be extremely careful with how, money is spent, spend it carefully, spend it on priority issues. What I can't do right now is, especially considering we have a significant transportation backlog in maintenance of our roads and bridges, which in my opinion constitutes, and in fact in the opinion of the Transportation Finance Commission, constitutes a very real potential public safety issue. We need to look at every possible alternative for filling that gap, but if there are no other alternatives for addressing a potential public safety issue, I certainly cannot take any options off the table, including any kind of approach to generating new revenue sources.
Okay. As part of the budget cuts, Governor Patrick...
Can I get a response to that, David?
Sure. Sorry. I thought you were all set with that.
No, not at all. Actually, I think, and then this is absolutely a fundamental difference between myself and my opponent. She, to my mind, much like too many of our elected officials, pays lip service to the notion of reform first. But, it's been years that people running for office and people in office have said, oh, last resort. We'll go, tax increases are a last resort. And yet, our tolls keep going up, our taxes keep going up. Everyone talks about the need to attract new business, but the legislature at the end of this session added $1 billion in new business taxes.